The consumers really demanded it now. They know that the product's available in Japan.
$2.99.
Steve Race got up there and just said $2.99 and walked away. That was like a blow to the stomach for a lot of people in Sega of America.
It was the early 1990s, and Sega was on top of the world. Sonic the Hedgehog was outselling Mario. Kids were trading their Super Nintendos for Genesis consoles. Sega! And Sega's infamous slogan, "Sega does what Nintendon't,"
Genesis does!
echoed through living rooms like a battle cry. But what happened? How did a company that once ruled American living rooms end up disappearing from the console business altogether? This isn't just a story about hardware. It's about marketing wars, internal power struggles, technological misfires, and one devastating gamble. Sega didn't just fall, they crashed in a way that changed the gaming industry forever. In this video, we're diving deep into the rise and fall of Sega's console empire, from their glory days battling Nintendo to their final swing with the Dreamcast. You'll hear about wild marketing campaigns, shocking business decisions, and the exact moment Sega lost their grip. And trust me, some of the twists in this story are so insane, you'll swear it was fiction. But it's not. Sega really had the lead. They really had the talent, and they really lost it all. Buckle up, because by the end of this, you'll know exactly how Sega lost the console wars. In the late 1980s, the video game world was ruled by one name, Nintendo. With the NES, they held over 90% of the market. Every kid wanted a Nintendo. Every parent was buying one, and their library of titles like Super Mario Bros. And Zelda and Metroid became instant classics. Sega was a small-time player, known mostly for their arcade games and the underwhelming Master System. But they had plans, and one console would change everything. In 1989, Sega launched the Genesis in North America. In Japan, it was called the Mega Drive, but in the US, the Genesis name stuck, and so did the message. This wasn't just a new console, it was cooler. It had faster games, more detailed graphics, and an edgy marketing campaign that spoke directly to teenagers. While Nintendo kept its wholesome, family-friendly image, Sega leaned into something grittier. And then came the real game changer, Sonic the Hedgehog. Released in 1991, Sonic wasn't just another mascot. He was the anti-Mario. Blue instead of red, fast instead of methodical, full of attitude instead of charm. He zipped through levels at lightning speed, with loop-de-loops and vibrant backgrounds that screamed, "Next generation." And Sega bundled Sonic with every Genesis system, instantly giving the console a killer app and giving parents more value for their dollar. Behind the scenes, a man named Tom Kalinske was running Sega of America. A former Mattel executive, he understood American marketing like few others in the industry. Kalinske made bold moves, slashing the Genesis's price, building relationships with major third-party developers like EA, and pouring millions into aggressive advertising. His team's strategy was simple: paint Nintendo as old news and Sega as the future.
What Nintendon't.
Genesis does what Nintendon't. That was the tagline, and it hit hard. Sega's commercials were fast-paced, loud and rebellious, like the games themselves. Kids and teens took notice. Sega suddenly wasn't just a console, it was a statement, and it worked. By 1993, Sega had grabbed over 60% of the US 16-bit console market. They had taken a massive chunk out of Nintendo's dominance and were now seen as a real threat. Franchises like Madden NFL, Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, and Sonic helped define the Genesis era. Sega was no longer a challenger, they were a leader. But success came with new pressure and new expectations. And inside Sega, cracks were already forming. You see, while Sega of America was soaring, Sega of Japan wasn't always on the same page. Tensions between the two branches were rising, And as the gaming world moved toward a 32-bit future, Sega's next moves would test their unity and ultimately unravel everything they'd built. Because what came next wasn't just a stumble, it was a slow-motion collapse. Sega had the lead. They had the momentum. But as the gaming world shifted toward more powerful hardware in the mid-90s, something changed. Sega started making decisions that, in hindsight, looked like the beginning of the end. The first red flag? The Sega CD. Released in 1992, the Sega CD was an ambitious add-on that promised full-motion video, CD-quality sound, and more storage than traditional cartridges. But the reality was underwhelming. The graphics were grainy, the gameplay was shallow, and most titles felt like low-budget movie experiments rather than true video games. Worst of all, it was expensive, around $300 at launch, and required a Genesis just to work. It fragmented the player base and confused customers.
You still don't have a Sega CD?
Well, actually, I do.
But Sega wasn't done. In 1994, they released another add-on, the 32X. This was marketed as a cheap way to get into 32-bit gaming without waiting for Sega's next-gen console. It plugged into the Genesis, added 2 more processors, and promised a new era of advanced gaming. The result? A clunky, awkward Frankenstein console that was incredibly difficult to develop for. Only about 40 games were ever released for it, and most looked like slightly upgraded Genesis titles. Now, imagine being a parent in the 90s. You bought a Genesis, then Sega CD, then 32X, only to hear that Sega was launching another console, the Saturn. Frustration set in. Sega's brand loyalty started to crack. And the Saturn's launch? That might be one of the most damaging moves in console history. In May 1995, Sega stunned the world at E3 by announcing that the Saturn would be available immediately. Retailers and developers had expected a September release, but Sega pushed it early to get ahead of Sony's PlayStation. The surprise backfired. Major retailers like Walmart and KB Toys were left out of the early launch and refused to stock the system. Developers were caught off guard too. Many weren't ready with games. And the hardware itself? The Saturn was powerful but notoriously complex. It had dual CPUs that were difficult to code for, especially compared to the upcoming PlayStation. Sony's console was cheaper, easier to develop for, and had a clear marketing vision, appealing to both gamers and adults with a sleek, futuristic design and cool-as-ice ads. While Sega scrambled, Sony soared. By the end of the 90s, the PlayStation was dominating, with a deep library that included Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, and Gran Turismo. Meanwhile, the Saturn was floundering in the West, especially in the US, where Sega had once reigned supreme. But perhaps the most painful part of this era wasn't just the technology or the competition. It was internal. Sega of Japan and Sega of America were at war. Tom Kalinske, the man who made the Genesis a success, wanted to delay the Saturn and refine its strategy. Sega of Japan ignored him. They pushed the Saturn forward, dismissed American input, and refused to coordinate on development or marketing. Kalinske eventually resigned, disillusioned by the politics and chaos. The split between Sega's 2 divisions became a slow poison, and it would infect their next and final console too. Because if the Saturn was a stumble, the Dreamcast would be a leap of faith, off a cliff. After the chaos of the Saturn era, Sega was bleeding. Their market share had collapsed, their leadership was fractured, and their reputation, once untouchable, was now shaky at best. But they weren't done. Not yet. In 1999, Sega placed one last desperate bet, the Dreamcast. And for a moment, it seemed like it might actually work. The Dreamcast was a bold move, technologically ahead of its time and packed with innovation. It was the first console with a built-in modem for online play, years before Xbox Live. It featured a custom operating system based on Windows CE, fast load times, and an impressive launch lineup. Even the controller had something new. The Visual Memory Unit, VMU. A tiny screen that slid into the controller and let you save games, play mini-games, and view stats in real time. Sega's marketing was also aggressive and focused. The US launch on September 9, 1999 was massive.
It's thinking.
With a sleek It's Thinking ad campaign and a strong lineup including Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, NFL 2K, and Power Stone, it became the most successful console launch in history at the time. Over 500,000 units were sold in the first 2 weeks in North America. Gamers were impressed. Critics were impressed. Even developers were excited. The Dreamcast was easy to develop for compared to the Saturn, and it seemed like Sega was finally back on track. But lurking in the shadows was a juggernaut that would crush everything: Sony. Just months after the Dreamcast launch, Sony started teasing the PlayStation 2, and the hype was overwhelming. Promising cutting-edge graphics, backward compatibility with PS1 games, and most critically, the ability to play DVDs, something no console had ever done. It became a media sensation. People weren't just buying a gaming machine, they were buying a home entertainment system. Suddenly, the Dreamcast looked dated, and Sega couldn't compete. They had no DVD support, no widespread third-party backing from giants like Electronic Arts or Squaresoft. In fact, EA outright refused to develop for the Dreamcast, choosing to save their big franchises for the PlayStation 2. That meant no Madden, no FIFA, no NBA Live. For many gamers, that was a deal-breaker. Worse, Sega was running out of money. They had burned through resources with the Saturn and lost investor confidence. Every Dreamcast sold was being discounted to stay competitive, cutting deeply into their profits. Sega was trapped. They needed the Dreamcast to succeed fast, but they didn't have the cash or time to wait. By late 2000, the writing was on the wall. Despite its innovation, despite its passionate fan base, the Dreamcast couldn't survive the tsunami that was the PS2. Game developers started pulling support. Consumers hesitated, and Sega was forced to make a decision. On January 31, 2001, Sega announced it was discontinuing the Dreamcast. Just 2 years after launch, it was over. Sega was exiting the console business. It was a heartbreaking moment. Not just for Sega fans, but for the industry. Because the Dreamcast wasn't a bad console. In fact, it was brilliant. But timing, bad luck, and a decade of poor decisions had finally caught up. And just like that, the company that once ruled the living room, who had given Nintendo a run for their money, was now a third-party publisher. No more hardware. No more Sonic headlining a Sega console. Just games. After the brutal failure of the Sega Saturn, Sega was teetering on the edge. Their dominance from the Genesis era was gone. Their reputation had taken a hit, their leadership was in disarray, and financially they were in trouble. But instead of folding, Sega doubled down. They went all in on a new console that would either save them or finish them. That console was the Dreamcast. And at first, it looked like Sega had finally gotten it right. The Dreamcast was released in Japan in late 1998 and hit the US on September 9, 1999. 9/9/99. It was the most ambitious launch Sega had ever attempted. The marketing campaign was sleek and mysterious, with the tagline, "It's Thinking." They poured millions into advertising, wrapped city buses, ran TV spots, and plastered billboards. Sega was trying to make a comeback, and gamers were paying attention. The console itself was ahead of its time. It featured a custom-built graphics processor capable of delivering visuals that rivaled arcade machines. It came with a built-in 56K modem for online play, long before broadband internet was common. It used GDROMs, a new disc format that offered more storage than CDs, and its controller had something brand new: the VMU, or Visual Memory Unit, a detachable memory card with a screen that could show health bars, mini-games, or inventory on the fly. And then there were the games. At launch, players got Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, NFL 2K, Power Stone, and House of the Dead 2. These weren't just good games, they were system sellers.
Hey kid, how about a game?
Game?
Soul Calibur, in particular, was hailed as one of the best fighting games ever made. The visuals were jaw-dropping, the gameplay was smooth, and the system ran like a dream. It wasn't just hype, the Dreamcast delivered. The result? A record-breaking launch. Sega sold over 500,000 units in the first 2 weeks in North America alone. It was the most successful console debut in US history at that time. For a brief moment, it looked like Sega had pulled off a miracle. Reviewers were ecstatic. Gamers were thrilled. Even developers started coming back, enticed by the Dreamcast's ease of programming compared to the nightmare of the Saturn. But Sega's biggest problem wasn't itself. It was Sony. Just months after the Dreamcast hit the shelves, Sony began teasing the PlayStation 2. And this wasn't just another console, it was a media revolution. The PS2 promised next-generation graphics, DVD playback, and backward compatibility with the massive PS1 library. That meant millions of gamers could upgrade to a new system and still play their old favorites. On top of that, the PS2 would double as a DVD player, something that, in 2000, was still a luxury item. Sega couldn't compete with that. While the Dreamcast was impressive, it lacked a DVD drive. It couldn't play movies, and GDR-OMs were a proprietary format that developers weren't thrilled about. Worse, Sega had a terrible relationship with some of the biggest third-party developers. EA, for example, refused to make games for the Dreamcast. That meant no Madden, no FIFA, no NBA Live. For sports fans, that was a deal-breaker. Squaresoft, makers of Final Fantasy, also stuck with Sony. As anticipation for the PS2 grew, sales of the Dreamcast began to stall, and Sega's past was catching up to them. Retailers were cautious. Many were still upset over the surprise Saturn launch and didn't trust Sega to stick around. Developers hesitated to invest in a console they weren't sure would survive. And financially, Sega was in deep trouble. The company had burned through massive amounts of cash during the Saturn years and was now selling the Dreamcast at a loss to stay competitive. Despite great games like Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, Skies of Arcadia, and Phantasy Star Online, the Dreamcast couldn't maintain its early momentum. By late 2000, Sony launched the PlayStation 2 to overwhelming demand. It was sleek, powerful, and came with the full backing of the gaming industry. The PS2 crushed everything in its path. Sega held out as long as it could, but on January 31st, 2001, they officially pulled the plug. The Dreamcast would be discontinued and Sega would exit the console business for good. The announcement shocked fans and devastated the company's loyal developers. Sega had gone from being the face of gaming in the early 90s to exiting the hardware space entirely within a single decade. But the Dreamcast didn't fail because it was a bad console. It failed because Sega had spent the 1990s burning bridges, both with players and with the industry. They had confused consumers with too many add-ons. They had fractured their company with infighting between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. And they had lost the trust of developers with bad hardware choices and poor long-term vision. The Dreamcast was their final shot, and despite being a brilliant piece of tech, it simply came too late. But the story doesn't end there. Because while the Dreamcast marked the end of Sega's console dreams, it left behind a powerful legacy. When Sega pulled the plug on the Dreamcast in 2001, it felt like the end of an era. The company that had once gone toe-to-toe with Nintendo and revolutionized the gaming industry was now retreating from hardware. But even in failure, Sega left behind a legacy that still echoes through gaming today. First, let's talk about the Dreamcast itself. While it failed commercially, the console was far ahead of its time. Online gaming on consoles? Sega did it first. Titles like Phantasy Star Online gave players their first taste of what would later become the backbone of Xbox Live and PlayStation Network. The VMU concept, offering a second screen experience, foreshadowed Nintendo's later attempts with the DS and Wii U. The Dreamcast also gave birth to several cult classics: Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, Crazy Taxi, Skies of Arcadia, and Rez. Many of these games would go on to influence titles years down the road. Sega also helped normalize the idea that consoles could be stylish, multimedia devices. While the Dreamcast lacked a DVD drive, its sleek design and unique interface helped push the idea that consoles were more than just game machines. They were entertainment hubs. Sony would perfect this with the PlayStation 2, but Sega laid the groundwork. Then there's the matter of third-party development. Once the Dreamcast was retired, Sega reinvented itself. They stopped making consoles and started making games for their former rivals. It was a stunning shift. Sonic the Hedgehog, once the face of anti-Nintendo rebellion, was now showing up on GameCube. Sega released titles on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. Some fans saw this as a defeat, but it was also a survival move. And it worked. Sega found success again with franchises like Yakuza, Total War, and Football Manager. They kept beloved IPs like Sonic, Virtua Fighter, and Persona alive through partnerships and smart publishing. While they never returned to the hardware business, Sega proved they could still matter, just in a different role. So what are the lessons here? First, innovation alone isn't enough. The Dreamcast had brilliant features, but Sega's damaged relationships, poor timing, and lack of support sunk it. No matter how great your product is, if people don't trust your brand or can't find the games they want, it won't matter. Second, internal unity matters. The war between Sega of Japan and Sega of America weakened the company's decision-making at crucial moments. When your teams aren't aligned, the market will notice, and your rivals will take advantage. And finally, never underestimate your opponent. Sega took the Genesis to war with Nintendo, and won for a while. But they underestimated Sony. They didn't see the full scope of the PlayStation strategy, and by the time they realized it, it was already too late. But Sega didn't disappear. They adapted. And in doing so, they became a rare example of a company that lost the console wars, but still found a way to survive. Sega's story is one of the wildest in video game history. They went from underdog to king. From knocking Nintendo off the throne with Sonic and the Genesis, to creating some of the most beloved and innovative games of their time. They pioneered features we now take for granted. Online play, visual memory units, modern 3D fighting games, and even open-world storytelling. At their peak, they weren't just competing, they were leading. But a string of rushed releases, hardware misfires, internal conflict, and a failure to see the storm coming ultimately brought them down. The Sega CD and 32X split their fan base. The Saturn's disastrous launch lost the trust of both retailers and developers. And despite all the brilliance of the Dreamcast, it came too late. Sony's PlayStation 2 wasn't just a better console, it was a masterclass in strategy and hype. Sega didn't lose because they didn't have good ideas. They lost because they couldn't get out of their own way. Yet even in defeat, Sega's DNA runs deep in modern gaming. The lessons they learned about timing, trust, and technological innovation have shaped how today's consoles are built and sold. The Dreamcast, though gone, is still remembered with love. And Sega? They're still here, still making games, still trying new things. The console wars moved on, but Sega's legacy remains. And now you know the full story of how Sega lost the console wars. Like what you heard. Smash that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into gaming history, and drop a comment with your favorite Sega memory. We've got plenty more stories coming, some you've never heard, and some that'll blow your mind. Stay tuned.